Week we are diving into what we call Byzantium. We will see where that word comes from, what it refers to, etc., and then the development of monasticism. So our era generally takes us from about 300 CE to about 800 CE this week. The basic timeline is that around 285, the Emperor Diocletian, the same one that we discussed as having persecuted Christians in his own time, split the Roman Empire into two halves. This was in an attempt to make the empire more manageable. It had become so large in land mass that they were having trouble actually functionally running the empire. Diocletian has been credited by some as buying the empire as a whole more time than it existed for, that it was on the verge of collapse, and he kind of forestalled that. We will look at a map here in a moment of what that looked like. By 313, we have Constantine's Edict of Toleration for the Christians. 324, we have his Council of Nicaea that determines our understanding of the Trinity in the Catholic Church. And of course, today, many other, if not most other Christian denominations. By 391, Christianity is made the state religion of the Roman Empire. So we've flip-flopped from completely illegal to 100 years later being the state religion. And in 414, we see then that intolerance has shifted onto pagans, or those who continue to believe in traditional Roman religion, with the murder of the pagan Hypatia, who is a noted mathematician. 430 is the death of a man named Augustine, who we will talk about a bit. He is considered one of the early church fathers. So what that means is that his writings on theology, things like that, are taken to be sort of worthy, true, etc., by the Christian church, by the Catholic Church specifically, as being non-heretical, right? They're canonical, not so much as the Gospels, but they can be studied and read for deeper understanding of theological questions. In 476, we're going to have what some would call the end of the Roman Empire, though is more accurately called the end of the Western Roman Empire, with the last Western Roman emperor deposed. When Diocletian split the Roman Empire into two, he made it to where there were two emperors simultaneously, one over the eastern half of the empire and one over the western half. What we'll see is that the eastern half continues up until 1453, so another almost 1,000 years after this. So Rome does not exactly fall per se, but half of it dissolves into other kingdoms. We will see one Eastern emperor, Justinian, though, attempting to kind of reconquer a lot of these territories. And between 535 and 554, he will reconquer much of the lost Western territories. We will see that as we go along. Though this will not last much past his lifetime, what does last a long time after his life is his ordering of the kind of collection of laws that are referred to as the Corpus Juris Civilis, so the body of civil law. These laws are, of course, important in their own time, but will also have continued importance into the Middle Ages, as many Western kingdoms will model their law codes off of Justinian's law codes here. Okay, but first, we looked at last week how martyrdom was a way in which Christians could prove their faith during the centuries before it was legalized. Once it is legalized, martyrdom doesn't really happen all that much anymore. Certainly it will still happen, but not with nearly the frequency. And so there is no longer this avenue to prove your faith. And so Christians are going to have to find a new way to sort of, quote, prove their faith in their own eyes and perhaps the eyes of onlookers. What this will develop into then is the ascetic ideal, or monasticism. This will create new opportunities for men, but also for women, and is a rejection of sex, of course, as anyone who is monastic or ascetic is voluntarily celibate, a rejection, therefore, of motherhood by women, and a rejection of the family structure and life, because they are going to not start their own families, but also leave their natal families in order to be a part of these ascetic lifestyles. This will gain women kind of a manly sort of persona as they are seen to be rejecting feminine weakness. We'll talk about how this all kind of mental gymnastics for this happens, but it becomes something that people find impressive and therefore in this time manly. So how does this all begin then? It's going to begin in the Egyptian desert with a man named Anthony who lived from reportedly 251 to 356. So supposedly he lived to be 105 years old and was, at the start of his life, an Egyptian peasant. He was inspired, he says, to renounce the material world, to sell off the inheritance he was going to gain from his parents, and to go out and live in the desert as a hermit. So without home, without anchor, and without aid. The idea he had was that he could reclaim the, quote, purity of Adam before the fall, right? That Adam and Eve did not have all of these kind of social nets for them or these various goods to make their lives easier. And that they were before, of course, the eating of the apple, right? Better, right? They were ideal humans. They were what God had intended, and that if we could try to get back to that, then perhaps we could regain some of the promise of, the Garden of Eden. This was a very attractive idea to a lot of people, and he had quite the community of followers by about 305 CE, which is somewhat ironic because he wanted to live alone and be left alone in order to simply pray and kind of be with himself, with God. But nonetheless, people flocked to him. Okay, so what we have then to give us a lot of this information is a text called Life of Anthony, written around 350 CE, within which we get, of course, the information about how he found kind of asceticism, but also that there were pre-existing communities of Christian women already kind of engaging in this style of kind of voluntary hardship in their lives. What we'll see, though, is that women will begin to be connected with urban monasticism, so those who live a more challenging lifestyle but in cities still. And desert monasticism will be connected to men, so those who leave the comforts of culture, of society, in order to live an ascetic lifestyle. This will be referred to as eremitic, specifically referring to the fact that they live sort of alone. Even if they live alone in community, they would kind of be, like little pods, right? Like separated from themselves or each other. The desert men then come to be referred to as either hermits or anchorites. Hermit coming from eremitic, so being alone. And it was felt that women were too much of a danger, or in too much danger, being out alone in the desert like this. And additionally, if they were in communities with men, they posed too much of a sexual threat. It would be too tempting to have the opposite sex around to maintain the ideal of a voluntary celibacy. And so women were not ideally wanted in these communities. However, we know that desert mothers existed alongside desert fathers nonetheless. There were women who chose to leave society, live in the desert, based on Christian ideals. So this is, from its inception, not exclusive to men, even if we're going to see it by necessity in the minds of the founders become a gender-divided kind of institution. The idea in all of this, though, the base notion was that asceticism would bring you closer to God. That was the entire goal here, right? And the difficulty of asceticism kind of mimicked the difficulty and hardship associated with martyrdom. Okay, the spiritual feats that we know desert mothers are credited with include living in caves, fasting, only eating as much food as was necessary for survival, and sort of living in continuous prayer. That the idea was that you did nothing else with your time. Self-denial in this way, right? Denying adequate sleep, adequate food, etc., or the other sort of pleasures of life, right? Sex, entertainment, luxury goods, whatever, even family, right? Made them more, quote, manly. There is the distinct possibility that this was interpreted in part because extreme fasting likely halted the menstrual cycle of these women. If you do not have a high enough body fat content, you will not have a period because your body recognizes that it is an inhospitable place for a fetus to develop, right? To that end, a lot of like high level athletes, gymnasts, things like that to this day experience that kind of thing. And so it may well have been that they noticed, the women themselves noticed in themselves that they were no longer menstruating, and thought, rather than an understanding of the need for a high enough kind of body fat, that it was instead the eschewing of feminine weakness. Because remember, many are going to believe that the shedding of blood in the menstrual cycle was the shedding of an excess of blood based on humoral theory, right, and the balance of the humors. And so if there's no blood to shed, that must mean you're in a better balance. We understand it better, but nevertheless, it was a logical leap for them in their understanding of the body. Gendered imagery, though, is still going to be used by these women because they will compare in their texts the cleansing of the spirit to the cleansing of clothing, right? So we still have this connection to what we perceive to be women's work in how they kind of conceptualize the lives they're leading. Some female monastics are known to have been penitent prostitutes. This is somewhat in imitation of Mary Magdalene, who's said to have been a prostitute who repented and becomes, a close confidant of Jesus. So the idea here was that you could leave any life and become better through monasticism. You did not have to be a good Christian who then took a step further. This was ideally open to any, and prostitution will be increasingly seen in a negative light by Christians. Communal monastic life. So as these people grow and attract more followers, they do begin to live in intentional communities, will be referred to as cenobitic. So that simply means like together in community. And this will develop in its more formalized form in southern Egypt. So still in Egypt, but by a man named Pachomius, pictured in later artwork on the left here. He lived from around 292 to 346, so nowhere near the astronomically long life of St. Anthony. But he wrote a rule for his monasteries, so literally just a guide by which they would live their lives outside of Thebes in Egypt around 326 CE. These sorts of rules for monastic living are going to become massively important, and we will see how they kind of travel and shift over the medieval period into today. There are still, of course, many of these sorts of communities still in existence. SLU is a great example of what those still engage in, because even though the Jesuits will not be founded for a further 1,200 years after this, they are a type of sort of ascetic community. Pachomius's rule called for very strict discipline amongst its followers, obedience to a leader called an abbot, which comes from Abba, father, right? And rigorous prayer. They were meant to be always praying unless they absolutely had to eat or absolutely had to sleep or any other kind of absolutely necessary activity, right? The abbots then lead these people called cenobites, and unruly monks, those who could not fulfill the strict requirements of Pachomius's rule, were liable within the rule to be either beaten into some kind of submission or expelled entirely from the community, told that they were not fit to be a part of the community.
If that happened, were they expected to just return to whatever life they had?
I don't know. It would probably depend on the individual. If they had truly broken ties with their family in a way that was like like angering to the family, they may not have been welcomed back. If they've been sent by the family to be a representative, well, then they failed and they may not be welcomed back. So but they may be. It's probably down to the individual experience on that one. Yeah. Both wealthy and poor people are known to have joined monasteries at this point. So this is not seemingly divided heavily by class. And one monastery we have at this time, so a place in which monastics live, right, in southern Egypt, is known to have had at its height around 1,800 women living in it and 2,200 men from between 348 and 464. So this is a massive community of people, and they lived in separate quarters based on gender. So what we see here then is not that you can only have men or only have women, but that they will not live in true community as far as like their barracks are concerned. Okay, so we do have, though, amongst other monasteries, all male monasteries, all female monasteries, and then other mixed communities, so men and women at this time as well. As far as we can tell, labor was divided by gender only in mixed communities. Of course, if you're in an all-male or all-female community, everybody has to do everything, right? There's not an option. This kind of gets us all the way back to, cavemen, prehistory, where it's not practical to say, well, you have to do this even if you're capable or we need you to do something else. But in mixed communities, they did seem to gender the activities along expected gender lines, right? Women doing sewing, things like that. Within these communities and between those in the communities and their original families, family ties were discouraged, and friendships even between monastics in the communities were discouraged. The idea was that you were here to deepen your connection to God, to serve God, and not to make friends and make merry, right? So it's not necessarily, it's not an easy lifestyle to take on by any metric. We do know of some women, in particular a hermit named Thecla, dressing as a man in monastic community, but she appears to be a rare case. Instead, there appears to have been gendered kind of clothing expectations as well between male and female participants here. But in spite of what they wore, though, asceticism was, quote, the denial of the body, so bodily needs, right? And the body was associated with femininity. So femininity is going to be kind of placed in the negative association here throughout the entirety of this society, right? So female monastics get termed manly because they are eschewing some of this femininity, and denying physical needs becomes seen as masculine in these early days here. On the right, we have a photograph of a portion of the White Monastery as it exists to this day. So this is a through line for Christianity from very, very early times through to today, even if the participation levels are certainly far different than they were at the height of monasticism, perhaps. Okay, so at this time then, how are Christian theological ideas developing beyond monasticism? Because that's going to be kind of the extreme end of people who wish to prove their faith. Certainly not everybody who professes Christian faith is going to leave for a monastery. What we have is Greco-Roman philosophical ideas and medical ideas becoming integrated into Christian theology. We saw last week that part of what was done to make Christianity palatable to Romans was to bring it closer to the ideals of the Romans. That will kind of continue with philosophical and medical ideas. For example, they will agree with the idea from Soranus that virgins are healthier than those who are not virgins. This backs up their idea of celibacy as a superior way of life. We will also have them believing in Aristotle's claim that women are incomplete men, that something went wrong in the womb for them not to develop the rest of the way into men. Some of the main people that we have giving us the theological ideologies of the day and read by theologians to this day are several 4th century theologians. They come to be known as church fathers. Again, those who, as the church becomes more and more organized, more and more hierarchical, and comes to resemble what we see as the Catholic Church. Their teachings become accepted as official, accurate teachings. The first here is Augustine, who lived from about 354 to 430 CE. He is pictured on the left here from a 6th century fresco, so later on after his life, but I believe it was the earliest one that I could find. He is from North Africa. He converted to Christianity after quite a long mental struggle with his faith. He actually kind of waffled between several different faith ideas before deciding that Catholicism was the one true faith. He becomes then, as a Catholic, the Bishop of Hippo, and wrote during his time as a Christian, The City of God, which expounds for 1,000 pages on how you should live in kind of an idealized society. And then the Confessions, which is a kind of an autobiography in which he tells of his own life and struggles in finding Christianity and others. These are considered to this day classics of the theological genre. He saw marriage, as far as for our gendered understanding here, as a sacramental binding. This will be some of the earliest shifting of marriage from just a thing that happens into a true Christian sacrament, right? If any of you are Catholic or Episcopalian or any of the varieties that utilize the sacraments, it is considered one of the sacraments. It is one of the kind of holy moments of life. This is going to grow from people like Augustine saying, no, marriage is good. We want marriage in our society, even though we're going to say celibacy is better, because it too is holy and ordained by God, right? This is a step in the life of a good Christian. And he will actually uniquely disagree with the imperfection, finding instead that God would not make something imperfect, and that men and women were merely different. His opinion will not win out in his time, though. Another church father, Jerome, who lived around 340 to 420, is from Italy. And his primary contribution to Christianity, as we understand it, is that he translated the Bible from Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into the Latin. So it's referred to as the Vulgate Latin Bible. This is the one to consider when people say that Martin Luther's German Bible is the first time the Bible was translated into a spoken language of the people. That's not true. It is the first time it was translated out of Latin, but when they translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, that was putting it in the language of the people, right? This was so that it could be read by the people or understood by the people. So it's called Vulgate because it's in the vulgar language, the language of the people. So even though Latin will increasingly come to be not understood by Christians as the centuries go on, in its earliest several centuries of use, it was distinctly to be understood. Additionally, Jerome was an advisor to many of his followers, both male and female. We know this from a collection of around 120 surviving letters from him. And we do know from him, as far as gendered information, that he did believe women were more inherently sinful than men, and therefore had to work harder to go against a sinful nature. Another major figure of whom we will talk less, as you can see, is Ambrose from 340 to 397, who is most noted at this point as being the teacher to Augustine. He's the one whose professions of faith actually kind of meet Augustine where he lives, and causes him to see the Catholic faith as ideal. Okay, a female kind of ideal that we had at the time, who we discussed a little bit last week, is Helena. She is the mother of Constantine, who, if you recall from last week, legalized Christianity. Helena's full name is Flavia Julia Helena, and she lived from about 250 to 328 CE. She is originally from Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, basically. and was raised from a low social status by marrying Aurelius Valerius Constantius, who was the emperor of Rome, though for a very short time from 305 to 306, showing that there was, though rare, some amount of social mobility here. She lived at the court, at the official imperial court in Trier earlier in her life, and in Rome during her son's reign, during Constantine's reign. And actually held official titles, some of which were made for her, including Nobilissima Femina, which means most noble lady, and Augusta, in imitation of Augustus, which was still utilized by emperors as a title, kind of meaning best in a way. Most august, right? And it is thought that she converted to Christianity around 312 CE, likely in reaction to her son's legalization rather than as an inspiration for his legalization. One thing we will see as we continue into the next few weeks is that there are times where wives and mothers of kings and emperors, things like that, become the reason that those men convert and then convert their entire kingdom. In this case, I believe she is thought to have converted more in reaction to his opinion of Christianity. She makes a pilgrimage to Palestine in 326 CE for both political and pious reasons. Recall the Levant, the Holy Land, is at this point certainly a part of the Roman Empire. And then pious reasons, you want pilgrims, their entire kind of idea was to go to the places where Jesus had been. And on this pilgrimage, she allegedly discovered the, quote, true cross. This, among many other things, will be part of a massive culture of relics that we will talk about more as we go along this semester. She is buried in Rome and is venerated as a saint in both Orthodox and Catholic churches. We haven't talked about the Orthodox Church yet, but that's coming very soon. That is going to be the way in which Eastern Christianity splits away from the Western Catholic Christianity in the coming centuries that we will see here. But she is nevertheless a saint in both. Okay. And you can see here, the same statue that we looked at last week above, which was thought to have been re-sculpted to resemble her, and then one side of her sarcophagus where she is buried in Rome. So quite an elaborate, beautiful, I believe it's porphyry marble, which is this kind of rich red, purple color. So quite a bit of pomp and circumstance surrounding her. Okay, so how does this affect people? Going back to monasticism, asceticism, how does this affect people who generally were not able to actually leave their homes to become a monk or a nun, right? So many who convert to Christianity in the first place are inspired to do so by political or economic reasons rather than true faith-based reasons. You have to imagine as Christianity becomes legalized and then made the state religion, it was more and more dangerous to not be a Christian, but also you're going to find people increasingly unwilling to do business with people who aren't Christians, etc. On top of all of that, Rome is going to go so far as to offer tax breaks to bishops, so to those who are the leader of a particular area of Christians. So they've added even further incentives to people to join into this new religion. As I mentioned before, asceticism will replace martyrdom at this time, though, as the most rigorous proof of faith, as the best way to prove the strength of your faith. Okay, so those who cannot, though, or maybe don't want to, fully leave their family, leave their home to join a monastery, live as ascetics, but within their family homes. Letters from Jerome discuss raising your children as ascetics, that this was something that parents would attempt to keep their children as kind of pure and holy as possible, and raise them in this ideal. A few examples we have are a woman named Marcella, who died around 382, living ascetically in the home with her mother. And then another, Paula, from 347 to 404, as a mother, becoming an ascetic, living as an ascetic after her husband's death. She would even go so far as to found a double monastery, which merely refers to a monastery with both men and women, in the Holy Land, so in the Levant, in and around Jerusalem, with her daughter Eustochium in later life. For women like Paula, probably having greater wealth allowed for ease of travel for these women. You're not going to find a lot of women who perhaps want to live aesthetically in the home also being able to travel vast distances. Nevertheless, though, what we see for those who could is that they studied theology and conversed with church leaders as relative equals in the time. These women, of course, continue to be seen as feminine ideals as the church advances, and we have a painting on the right here from the 17th century CE of St. Jerome speaking with Saints Paula and Eustochium. Other examples of those who lived as ascetics and forwarded this growing cult of virginity are Melania the Elder, who died around 410. She is the daughter and granddaughter of consuls. So remember those leaders of Rome. A consul is still going to be a position in Rome. It's not as high as emperor, of course, but they will still have quite a bit of power. So she is certainly an elite woman, and chooses to live as an ascetic after being widowed. I am unsure if it was allowed because she was elite, because she was perhaps too old to produce more children and therefore not expected to remarry, or what the exact circumstances were. It is thought, though, that her family connections kept her safe in this choice, right? That she was allowed to live in a way that perhaps others would not have permitted her to live if she was not an elite woman. She founded a convent and a monastery in her lifetime, and inspired future generations to follow in her footsteps. Melania the Younger, who died in 439. This is a misprint here. She's the granddaughter, not the daughter of Melania the Elder. I have fixed that in the copy that will end up on Canvas. She lived as an ascetic with her husband after they had 2 children. It said that she very much wanted to live as an ascetic with him before that, but they knew they needed heirs. But once they had produced 2 children, they agreed to live ascetically. So what that's going to mean is, of course, restriction of food, restriction of sleep, celibacy, and then constant prayer as often as possible. She would actually leave for the court in Constantinople, which we will discuss here in a minute, and found an abbey in the area, so spreading then asceticism to the areas of power in Rome at this time, or in the Roman Empire at this time. These women are not going to be seen as traditional Roman women that we have seen, think all the way back to Livia on forward, because they're going to give up things like silk, which is going to be getting actually transported all the way from parts of Asia. They're going to instead wear shapeless robes of cotton or linen. Some specifically wore white, under the idea that it showed dirt and blood and hardship of life, right? Some are going to wear black because they felt it symbolized sin and repentance. And then some wore natural colors, so whatever color the fabric was on its own, specifically with the idea here that they were avoiding the extravagance, right, of either bleaching the fabric to make it white or dyeing the fabric to make it black or some other color. So we have different kind of modes of thinking on that, and that will continue as more and more monastic communities develop, that there is this kind of continued sort of disagreement between the best way to dress. Many will wear goat hair shirts. Literally, it's just shirts that are woven with goat hair, which is nowhere near as comfortable as sheep's wool, though at the time sheep's wool was not particularly comfortable either, and to this day 100% wool things are not particularly comfortable. But goat hair shirts would have been actually quite frustrating to wear, and so was done as a way of living in constant reminder of God's suffering for us, and this would continue as an idea of penitential behavior well into the Middle Ages, well into the Renaissance. Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, we'll talk about him way at the end of the semester, is known to have worn a goat hair shirt in, the 16th century. Just under his regular clothes, right? This will certainly be a long-standing tradition. And then many women wore their hair unkempt, so they didn't take care of their hair as they thought this was a sign of vanity, or they would veil their hair as a sign of not only lack of vanity, because hair could be something kind of luxurious, but also as kind of a purity kind of culture aspect where they're covering something that can be sexualized. By the 5th century, though, the church will demand that women, whether aesthetic or not, wear specifically female clothing. So some of this activity will be somewhat circumscribed as they do continue to insist upon gendered kind of clothing differences. The painting in the background here is of Saint Melania the Younger. It's a miniature from the Menologian of Basil II, who was a much, much later emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire around 1000. So just to show her continued kind of presence as an ideal in the Christian church. So asceticism then challenges Roman masculinity because in all its forms, whether a man or a woman is the one participating in it. This is largely because masculinity for the Romans was based on sex, right? Sexual prowess, the capacity to produce children, and military activity and success, right? You survive many battles, you kill many enemies, etc., etc. The church, though, instead is going to connect martyrs and then ascetics as soldiers of Christ. So this is going to sort of usurp masculinity or masculine kind of feats from what had long been the kind of ideal aspects of masculinity from Roman culture, from Greek culture, etc., right? So legalization of Christianity will challenge Roman culture, but it also challenges Christian culture. We see developments that are specifically a product of Christianity bringing itself into line with Roman ideals in order to become an acceptable religion to the Romans, causing certain shifts in Christianity, in particular, as we've looked at in this class and last week, some of the kind of greater hierarchical division between not just offices in the church, but between men and women. We have, from the time of the letters of Paul to the letters of Jerome, a very different status for women's participation in the church, right? Additionally, celibacy will replace marriage as being the highest valued way to live. You have to remember that in basically every society we've looked at before, once marriage became an organized institution, that was kind of the best way to live because you were then going to produce children and continue the species, right? Now we've kind of got this turn away from that, in part, as we discussed last week, because some people believe the apocalypse is nigh. We don't need to continue to repopulate the earth because the rapture is coming. But then from others simply because many different people from the Christian faith, in the stories within the Bible, specifically, Jesus, etc., were voluntarily celibate, and that was done to strengthen their faith, to maintain their purity, and all of that. Family, long the kind of cornerstone of society as well, will become secondary to faith as what they believe should be the most important thing in your life, right? Remember, the oikos, right? The paterfamilias, all of these things, the kyrios, had long been this bastion around which society was structured. Now this is going to shift to your faith being more important than your family. We see this with Saint Perpetua, as she literally gives up not only her own life, but her young son and any kind of family life she could have had in order to, in her mind, live out her greatest Christian ideals, right, and be martyred at that time. All of this will recast faithful women, then, especially particularly faithful women, right, those who join monasteries, etc., as manly. So this will bring women, though a small percentage, into a realm where they can eschew essentially their manliness. So then it's a sea change for Rome, right? Christianity cannot be kind of understated as a shift in how the West is going to function.